There are quite a few things which go into the market review clause in leases. Would the valuer take into account the tenant's improvements in the building, or would they take into account the incentives which is currently in the marketplace? So it's important that you read that review and familiarise yourself with how the market review will be determined. G'day Cliffsters, I'm Ken Cliff, making property and personal finance videos for people with a bit of money and some knowledge, but they want to take the next step to direct investing. As always with all my videos, there is no thin marketing fluff, there is no expensive course, and there is no service upsell. Just a guy with maybe some runs on the board, giving you genuine content. Today's video is for Cliffsters who are considering commercial property investment, and when they look at real estate ad or speak to an agent, there is a lot of foreign terms which are used that can get quite confusing. And like the last video, I'm going to make it for both beginners in relation to understanding the definitions, but also for people with some commercial understanding. I'm going to make it a bit more spicy and interesting by throwing in some tips as I get prompted. So without further ado, let's get into it. And the first one is term. What is a term? Well, effectively, this is the further time left from the settlement date to the expiry of the lease. For example, if the tenant has a 5-year lease signed 2 years ago and you're planning to settle 2 years into the lease, the remaining term of that lease is 3 years. The other thing worth mentioning is the different types of rent reviews. It's pretty common to have a fixed review, which is simply a percentage each year that the lease goes up incrementally by. Then there is a CPI review. Basically, the ABS releases a CPI figure every quarter, and then this is used to calculate how much the lease goes up by every year. The final one is a little bit of a hybrid between the two, and this is basically the CPI plus a fixed percent. It might be CPI plus 1 or 2%, and it's also worthwhile referring back to the lease to work out which basket of CPI the lease will use to dictate the rent review. Is it a state-based basket or is it a national basket? The final type of review is a market review, and this commonly takes place when an option is exercised on the property by the tenant. And basically what happens is the landlord kind of gives the tenant a rate that they want to increase the rent by. Now, there's a couple of things which might happen here depending on the type of lease. The tenant can push back, request a valuation, they can mediate it, or they may just accept what the landlord suggests is the market rent. There are quite a few things which go into the market review clause in leases. Not only the arbitration process which you must follow, but it also includes things like, would the valuer take into account the tenant's improvements in the building, or would they take into account the incentives which is currently in the marketplace? So it's important that you read that review and familiarise yourself with how the market review will be determined. The next thing worth mentioning is what's known as a ratchet clause. Basically, it's words to the effect of a rent can't be less than the previous year. What this means is despite if the market rent goes down and the fixed reviews increase and ratchet up over time, the lease can't revert back down to what the market might be. In some retail shops' leases, this type of clause is prohibited, and it is a statutory requirement that the rent is adjusted back to market. Which gets me onto incentives, and what an incentive figure is what the landlord would pay to the tenant in order to secure them renting their property. It's quite common to express this as a percentage of the first term. So for example, if the lease is $100,000 a year on a 5-year term, and there is 20% incentives in the marketplace, the incentive amount would be $100,000, or basically the first year rent free. There are all different things you can do for incentives, such as a rent free period, giving the tenant cash, which is probably the least preferred, or adding to their improvements. And a good leasing agent should be able to give you an idea of what other incentives are in similar deals which were recently cut. And that reminds me, why don't you just go down there and hit the subscribe button, because that just gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling and encourages me to produce more of this great content. The next term worth talking about is make good, which is a common clause in many leases. Basically, it makes the tenant repaint, redecorate, or make good any wear and tear on the property when they vacate the property, or in some instances when they renew their lease for a further term. A separate part of make good, but commonly related to it, is also the strip out. So if the tenant has put any improvements in the property, there will be a requirement that they remove it out of the property prior to them vacating. As a landlord, the make good clause is quite a handy tool, and there's actually a lot of things which can be done. Two common things are when you are coming up to an option renewal period with the tenant and there is a make good clause when you renew the lease, it's common that the landlord might say, well, if you renew your lease early, or on favourable terms to me, I'll waive the benefit of the make good clause, provided of course the building still presents well and the tenant is happy to occupy as it currently stands. The other good area for negotiation with the make good clause is, say for example the tenant is not going to renew their lease for a further term and they're going to vacate completely and they have to remove their fit out and have to make good, repair, repaint, and this might cost say $50,000 or $100,000. Well, the landlord could say to the tenant, for example, if you pay me cash in lieu for the make good, say $60,000 or $70,000, I'll just leave it all in there. And then with the improvements that are in the property, they can use this as part of their releasing campaign to find a new tenant. Plus there's already $70,000 of cash in lieu payment that they can put towards making that existing fit out right for the next new tenant coming in. When dealing with the initial lease document, there's two things which can happen. There can be a lease variation and a lease extension. So what is a lease variation? Basically, a lease variation is when part of the lease is changed. This might relate to a special condition, this might relate to a term, this might relate to a rent review, but basically it's any change to the lease. Whereas a lease extension is when the practical part or operating component of the lease stays the same, but basically you renew the lease for a further term with all the other conditions intact. When conducting due diligence into the lease, it's also important to consider the lease variation and extensions because these documents commonly, provided they're executed correctly, supersede the lease agreement, and therefore if there's been any changes to the lease in this, these will be carried forward to when you are the landlord of the property. Now we get into another little pro tip / grey area, which is called a side deed. Effectively, a side deed is an agreement with the current landlord or current tenant, which doesn't necessarily, unless there's an assignment right, carry forward to the new landlord or new tenant. Meaning there can be things which are hidden from you when considering a lease or a variation and extension. So it's important that they warrant that the lease is accurate and there is no side deeds as part of the contract. But side deeds are important and they're not just something to hide a future purchaser into. So some of the things which a side deed can deal with include, in a pub scenario, a transfer of a liquor license, or if there's an operating business that has some kind of co-value with the property, say as IP for a trading name, then there could be a side deed as to what happens with that business name should the tenant vacate. And finally, there might be a first right to lease more space or a first right to purchase a property. The other term commonly thrown around with leases is options, or 2+2 or 5+5. Basically, an option is a right but not an obligation for the tenant to extend the term of their lease. The next clause or term which I want to discuss is what's known as a redevelopment clause. Now, this is not something that commonly sits within leases, but sometimes if the building has a redevelopment opportunity, the landlord will negotiate with the tenant to allow them to evict or remove them or move the tenant into an alternative premises in the case of a redevelopment. Commonly, this clause has a period at which it's not effective. Then there is a notification period where the landlord lets the tenant know that they want to remove them, and then there's a period that the tenant has an opportunity to move out the property. This clause is important for landlords who have a redevelopment site where the improvements on that site aren't that substantial, because as you can imagine, if there is a lease that has a long term remaining on it, this would limit any developers considering that site in the case of a resale. Let's quickly talk about the difference between face rents and effective rents, because this is important to consider in the case of a market review. Face rents are quite simply the net rent which is being paid to the landlord, where effective rents are a little bit different. Effective rents are when the incentives are taken into account on the face rents. What happens is the market dictates an incentive, and then that incentive is amortized into the face rent. For example, if the incentive is 20% in the marketplace, this would mean a face rent would be discounted by 20%. And do you know what the final condition of this lease should be? Hit the like button, subscribe down there, and together let's get this video to the top of Commercial Property Investment Australia, because by doing that it gives me the encouragement to make more of this awesome free content. What I tend to find is oh, you've got a can of spray, bud. Are you serious? So now you know all of those complicated little lease terms with commercial property investing. So until you find a commercial property lease that you like, or my next video, best of luck and goodbye.